They don't always run from love. Sometimes they run from what love reveals about them. Welcome to Avoidant Patterns, where we break down the hidden psychology behind emotional distance, attachment wounds, and the silent push and pull that happens in relationships. In today's topic, we're exploring what really happens when an avoidant meets someone who awakens emotions they thought they had buried long ago, and why that connection can feel so intense, confusing, and unforgettable. They often say that an avoidant runs away from love, but what if that idea is too simple? What if the reality is more uncomfortable than that? What if the avoidant isn't actually escaping from you, but from something deeper? The version of themselves that starts to appear when they are around you? When a deeply intuitive, emotionally aware person enters their life, it doesn't just create attraction, it creates disruption. Everything the avoidant has kept buried doesn't stay hidden anymore. It starts rising to the surface. This is not just a story about rejection or emotional distance. It feels more like an inner conflict, a silent struggle happening inside the mind and heart. What looks like obsession is not really love in the usual sense. It becomes something more intense and harder to explain. It is the psyche reacting to something it cannot ignore anymore. Avoidant personalities are often labeled as cold, distant, or emotionally unavailable by choice, but in most cases, that emotional distance is not about cruelty or lack of feeling. It is a protection system. It is built from past emotional pain, where openness once led to hurt, neglect, betrayal, or abandonment. So instead of facing that pain again, they learn to shut it down. For them, emotional closeness is not peaceful. It feels overwhelming. It feels unsafe. Over time, they start to treat emotional depth like something dangerous, something to step away from instead of step into. So they build a life around control, distance, and self-protection. But underneath that structure, there is always another layer, a younger emotional self that once wanted love, connection, and understanding. That part of them did not disappear. It was just pushed down, hidden away, and forgotten. Yet it still exists in the unconscious mind, quietly influencing everything. Then comes the presence of someone emotionally open, often described as a super empath. This kind of person does not just show kindness or care on the surface. They naturally embody emotional honesty. They can feel deeply, express openly, and connect without controlling or manipulating. And this is where something strange begins to happen for the avoidant. They are not just attracted in a normal way, they feel something deeper, something they cannot easily put into words. It feels like recognition, like something inside them is being touched without permission. The empath mirrors qualities the avoidant has lost connection with. Emotional openness, sensitivity, intuition, the ability to love without fear of losing themselves. These traits don't just look attractive to the avoidant, they feel familiar in a painful way. It is not just about liking someone, it is about seeing something in them that reflects a forgotten part of the self, something that once existed but was pushed away for survival. This creates a strange emotional tension. On one side, there is pull, a sense of curiosity, comfort, even fascination. On the other side, there is fear, because getting closer means stepping into emotions they have spent years avoiding. To the empath, the avoidant often feels seen in a way they are not used to, not judged, not analyzed, but understood at a deeper emotional level. This kind of presence can wake up something long asleep in the avoidant psyche, a longing for closeness they thought they no longer needed. The empath doesn't force emotional openness, they simply exist in it, and that alone becomes powerful, because it quietly challenges everything the avoidant built to stay safe. So the avoidant feels torn. They want closeness, but closeness feels like exposure. They want connection, but connection feels like loss of control. The very thing they need becomes the thing they fear the most. This is why they often pull away. They may become distant, shut down emotionally, disappear, or act as if nothing deep is happening, but internally, something continues to linger. The image of the empath doesn't just fade, it stays. It shows up in thoughts when things are quiet. It appears in moments of stillness, sometimes even in dreams, not because of romance alone, but because the emotional impact touched something deeper than surface attraction. What the avoidant becomes attached to is not only the person, but what the person awakened inside them. The empath becomes a symbol of emotional wholeness that feels both comforting and painful at the same time. This is where obsession can begin to form. Not an obsession rooted in typical desire, but something more psychological. A pull toward what was lost within themselves. The empath becomes a living reminder of the emotional self they once had, or the version of themselves they never fully became. It starts to feel like a quiet inner conflict. The more they try to push it away, the more it returns, because it is not just about another person, it is about something inside them asking to be seen again. When someone like a super empath enters their emotional world, it doesn't just activate attraction, it can activate what psychology would call the shadow, the hidden parts of the self that were rejected or suppressed. For the avoidant, this shadow often holds emotional needs, fear of abandonment, desire for intimacy and vulnerability. Things they learned to see as unsafe or weak, so they pushed them away and built a stronger outer identity instead. But when they meet someone who naturally lives in emotional truth, those buried parts start to respond, not because they are being forced out, but because they are being reflected back. The empath carries emotional awareness in a way that feels grounding and honest. They don't collapse under emotional depth, they stay present in it. And that contrast makes the avoidant more aware of what they have been avoiding within themselves. This can create inner discomfort, confusion, restlessness, a feeling of being emotionally unsettled without fully understanding why. They may not even be able to explain what is happening internally, but they feel something shifting. And even if they try to disconnect, the emotional imprint remains. The mind may leave, but something deeper stays engaged. This is why the connection can feel so persistent, because what has been activated inside cannot simply be turned off. Once emotional awareness has been touched, it tends to keep resurfacing in different forms. The empath becomes a kind of emotional trigger, but also a mirror. They reflect not just who the avoidant is in the present, but what has been buried underneath all the emotional protection. And this is where the real tension exists. The avoidant is not only reacting to the person in front of them, they are reacting to the version of themselves they are being forced to remember. On a deeper level, this connection feels symbolic, almost like two opposite forces meeting. One is built around distance and self-protection, the other is built around emotional openness and connection. But it is not just a clash, it is also a kind of psychological invitation, an invitation to integrate what has been separated inside the self. The avoidant often feels both comforted and threatened at the same time. Comforted because something in the empath feels safe and emotionally familiar. Threatened because that same familiarity brings up vulnerability they are not ready to face. Meanwhile, the empath is often drawn to the hidden depth within the avoidant. They sense there is more beneath the emotional distance, not necessarily something to fix, but something unspoken that wants expression. So the connection becomes layered. It is not simple attraction, it is emotional recognition mixed with internal resistance. And because of that, the mind keeps returning to it, even when distance is created, even when communication stops. Something unresolved continues to exist in the background. The avoidant may believe they are stepping away from a person, but internally they are also stepping away from the emotional parts of themselves that were activated through that person. And that is why the pull doesn't fully disappear. It is not just about love or loss, it is about inner fragmentation. A part of the psyche recognizing something it has been disconnected from for a long time. So even in silence, even in distance, the connection remains psychologically active. Not as a relationship that continues outwardly, but as an experience that continues inwardly. Because once someone touches the emotional core that has been buried for years, the mind does not simply forget it. These behaviors are not planned manipulation or conscious harm. They usually come from fear, confusion, and a deep inner need to figure out whether the emotional safety they feel with the empath is actually real or just another setup for disappointment. So the avoidant might suddenly pull away. They may go quiet, become emotionally distant, act cold, or seem uninterested. On the surface, it looks like rejection, but internally, something very different is happening. In those moments, they are watching closely, not to hurt the other person, but to study the reaction, to see if the empath will leave, to see if they will get angry, to see if they will finally experience the same abandonment they have known before. It is almost like a silent emotional experiment, even if they are not fully aware of it. These withdrawals are not only defense mechanisms, they also become unconscious tests. A way of asking without words, will you still stay if I become difficult? Will you still care if I disappear emotionally? For the empath, who is naturally sensitive to emotional shifts, the response is often calm rather than reactive. Instead of chasing, panicking, or punishing, they remain steady. They respond with patience, understanding, and emotional presence. And this is where something unexpected happens inside the avoidant. They are used to a very different pattern. When they pull away, they expect anger. When they shut down, they expect abandonment. When they show emotional flaws, they expect rejection. That is the emotional reality they have learned to survive in. But the empath does not follow that script. The empath stays grounded. They don't collapse, they don't retaliate, and they don't disappear. They simply remain emotionally present in a calm way. And that completely disrupts what the avoidant thought was always going to happen. This creates confusion at first, then curiosity, then something deeper like fascination mixed with disbelief. The avoidant begins to notice something unusual. Their distance does not immediately destroy the connection. Their silence does not automatically end things. Their emotional inconsistency does not push the empath away the way it has in the past. Instead, the empath holds space for it, and this is unfamiliar territory. The obsession does not grow only from attraction. It grows because the empath becomes something rare in the avoidance experience. Someone who does not punish emotional imperfection. Someone who does not explode, chase, or collapse under emotional tension. That kind of stability feels unreal to them at first, almost hard to trust. So the avoidant begins testing more, not out of cruelty, but out of an unconscious need to confirm reality. They are trying to understand if this emotional safety will truly last or if it will eventually break like everything else before it. As the empath continues to respond with emotional steadiness, something shifts inside the avoidant. They start realizing that their usual strategies are not producing the expected results. Coldness does not drive the empath away. Silence does not end the bond. Emotional withdrawal does not lead to rejection. Instead, the empath remains consistent, and that consistency becomes deeply confusing, even unsettling, because it goes against everything the avoidant has learned about relationships. Slowly, curiosity replaces defense. They begin to observe the empath more closely, not just their actions, but their emotional stability, their ability to stay kind without becoming weak, their ability to stay open without losing themselves. The empath becomes an emotional mystery. How can someone stay so calm in emotional uncertainty? How can someone remain present without demanding reassurance? How can someone feel deeply but not fall apart when things become difficult? To the avoidant, this feels almost impossible to understand. And so the mind starts looping, thinking about interactions again and again, replaying conversations, questioning tone, meaning, presence, wondering what the empath truly thinks, even when nothing is being said directly. The testing continues, but underneath it, something else is growing, a quiet fixation, not fully recognized as attachment, but not fully separable either. What the avoidant is really responding to is not just the empath as a person, but the emotional experience they represent. The empath becomes a symbol of emotional safety that does not collapse under pressure. And for someone who has spent most of their life expecting emotional instability, that symbol becomes powerful. The avoidant begins to realize something uncomfortable. Their emotional distance does not create the usual outcomes anymore. Instead of pushing the empath away, it reveals more of the empath's steadiness. And that changes the internal dynamic completely. Now the avoidant is no longer just protecting themselves. They are also trying to understand something they have never fully experienced before, what it means to be emotionally accepted without conditions. But this is also where conflict starts, because emotional closeness still feels dangerous. Even when it is safe, it does not feel safe. Even when there is no rejection happening, the expectation of rejection still exists internally. So they stay caught between two forces, the desire to move closer and the instinct to pull away. The empath, in contrast, continues to respond without forcing anything. They do not chase the avoidance distance. They do not punish it either. They simply remain emotionally available in a steady way. And that stability leaves an imprint. Even when the connection becomes unstable or ends externally, the emotional memory does not disappear internally. The avoidant continues to carry it, not as a simple memory of a person, but as a living emotional reference point. In everyday life, they may try to move on, they may distract themselves or enter new situations, but internally, there is a return point they keep circling back to, a comparison they cannot avoid making. Other connections may feel different, not necessarily worse on the surface, but less emotionally alive, less real in terms of internal resonance. What is missing is not attention or validation. It is the emotional stillness they once experienced in the presence of the empath, the feeling of being able to exist without performing or protecting themselves constantly. That feeling does not easily get replaced. Over time, the avoidant may even begin to reflect the empath in small ways without realizing it. Certain ways of thinking, reacting, or understanding emotions may start to shift subtly, not because they are copying them, but because something in them was changed by the experience. The obsession, in this sense, is not about chasing a person. It is about chasing an internal state that was briefly awakened. Eventually, the avoidant starts to notice something else. Their old way of navigating emotions through distance, logic, and control does not bring the same sense of peace anymore. It feels incomplete. The encounter with the empath exposed another possibility, a way of relating that includes openness, emotional honesty, and presence without fear. And now that they have seen it, it becomes difficult to fully ignore. Even when the empath is no longer present, their emotional imprint remains active internally. In quiet moments, in reflection, in emotional triggers, the mind unconsciously asks questions like, how would they respond? What would they feel here? What would they understand that I am missing? It becomes a kind of internal reference point, not because the empath is controlling their thoughts, but because the experience reshaped how emotional truth feels to them. This is why the pull feels inescapable. It is not external attachment alone, it is internal restructuring. The empath becomes connected to a deeper shift inside the avoidant psyche, a shift they did not consciously choose, but still have to process. And this is where the experience becomes more than relational. It becomes psychological. The mind begins to recognize a split, one part that continues to operate from protection and distance, and another part that has been awakened to emotional depth and connection. The tension between these two parts creates discomfort, but also awareness. What feels like obsession is often the mind trying to reconcile those two internal states. The empath represents something the avoidant has long separated themselves from: emotional openness without fear, connection without collapse, presence without control. And once that has been experienced, even briefly, it does not fully disappear from internal awareness. Instead, it becomes something the psyche keeps returning to, trying to understand, integrate, or resolve. So even when the external connection is gone, the internal process continues. Because what was activated was not just attraction, it was recognition. What you're really circling around here is not just avoidant attachment or empath energy, but a deeper psychological loop between protection and emotional activation. An avoidant structure usually forms around one main survival idea: closeness is unsafe, but distance is controllable. So over time, the person doesn't just avoid people, they start to avoid the internal experience that comes with closeness. That includes dependency, softness, needing someone, and being seen too clearly. It's not that they don't feel those things, it's that they learned those feelings can cost them something. So their nervous system becomes very skilled at shutting things down the moment emotional intensity rises. Distance, silence, intellectualization, distraction, these are not personality traits in the casual sense. They are regulation strategies. Ways to stay stable when emotional closeness starts to feel like loss of control. Now, when someone emotionally open enters that system, especially someone who stays steady instead of reacting dramatically, it creates a strange mismatch. The avoidance internal prediction is, if I pull away, I will lose this person. But when that doesn't happen, their entire emotional model gets challenged. That's where the testing behavior comes in. Not because they are calculating, but because the nervous system is trying to find familiar ground again. It's almost like asking, where is the danger in this? Show me where this turns painful, because that's what I know how to navigate. So they withdraw, they go quiet, they create distance, and then they observe. Not just the other person, but their own internal reaction too. It's a form of emotional scanning. What makes the dynamic feel intense is that the empath-type person often responds in a way that doesn't reinforce the old fear pattern. Instead of escalating, chasing, or punishing, they stay emotionally consistent. That consistency interrupts the avoidance expectation loop. This is where confusion starts replacing certainty, because the avoidant is no longer dealing with a predictable emotional system. Their usual cause and effect logic in relationships stops working. When emotional distance doesn't create rejection, something else starts happening internally. Attention shifts inward. The avoidant starts noticing the connection more, not less. Not because they suddenly feel safe love, but because their system cannot categorize what is happening. And the mind tends to stay attached to what it cannot fully categorize. So the person becomes mentally present even when physically distant. Not in a romanticized way, but in a looping way. Thinking, revisiting, analyzing tone, replaying moments, questioning what the other person felt, what they meant, whether it is still there. But underneath that mental loop, something more important is happening. The empath isn't just another person in the avoidance life. They become a trigger for disowned emotional material. The parts of the avoidant that were shut down don't disappear, they get activated. That's why it can feel like obsession, but it's not really fixation on the individual in a simple sense. It's fixation on the internal state that emerged in their presence. A calmer way to say it is this: the person becomes linked to a version of emotional self that was briefly accessible and then lost again. And the nervous system doesn't like partial activation. It wants resolution, either full return or full shutdown. When neither happens, the mind keeps returning. This is also why, even after separation, the emotional imprint can remain active, not as longing in a straightforward way, but as comparison. Other people feel different, situations feel flatter. Nothing quite recreates that same internal shift. That doesn't necessarily mean the empath was perfect or irreplaceable. It means the nervous system registered a different emotional quality that it doesn't easily replicate. At the same time, it's important not to romanticize this too far. The empath is not magically healing the avoidant, and the avoidant is not secretly transformed just by presence. What's actually happening is friction between two regulation styles, one built on openness, one built on containment. That friction creates awareness, not automatic healing. In the end, what we are really looking at is not just an avoidant and an empath crossing paths, but a deeper internal conflict playing out through connection. The avoidant doesn't simply run from people, they run from the emotional experience that makes them feel exposed, unsteady, and out of control. But when someone enters their life who stays emotionally present instead of reacting with chaos, something unexpected happens. The old system stops working the way it used to. The empath doesn't force change. They don't chase or collapse. They simply remain emotionally open in a way that feels unfamiliar to the avoidant. And that unfamiliarity is what creates the intensity, not because it is toxic, but because it interrupts an old survival pattern. What gets called obsession is often the mind trying to resolve something unfinished. It is not just about a person, but about a state of being that was briefly experienced and then lost again. A sense of emotional safety that didn't turn into pain. A sense of being seen without consequences. That experience leaves a mark, not because it creates dependency, but because it exposes contrast. The contrast between emotional defense and emotional presence. Between shutting down and staying open. Between fear-based connection and grounded connection. So, the real conclusion is this: the connection becomes powerful not because one person completes the other, but because it reveals what was always unresolved inside. It brings awareness to emotional patterns that were previously unconscious. And once something like that is seen clearly, it doesn't simply disappear. It stays in the background of the mind, quietly influencing how future connections are felt, compared, and understood. In that sense, the entire experience is less about attachment and more about awareness, a reminder that what feels like external obsession is often an internal process asking to be understood, integrated, and finally brought into balance. If this helped you understand the deeper layers of avoidant patterns, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more content from Avoidant Patterns, and comment the word reflection if this message resonated with you and made you see relationships in a new way.